up to 2,000 pounds, any more, and the oxen pulling it would collapse long before you reached the Rockies. Horses were too delicate, mules too expensive. Oxen were the true engines of expansion, slow, stubborn, but unbreakable. Families slept in the wagons, under them or beside them. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. And despite what Hollywood suggests, people didn't ride inside all day. That would jostle bones and bruise backs. Most walked, mile after mile, day after blistering day. Wagons weren't just transportation, they were survival pods. They held medicines, spare wagon tongues, gunpowder, and seeds. Some even carried baby chicks in boxes beneath the wagon bed to start a coop once the family settled. And yet, for all their practicality, wagons were also symbolic. They were hope on wheels. Once the oxen were yoked, once the wheels creaked into motion, there was no turning back. The house was sold. The land behind was gone. All that remained was the trail, the sky, and the belief that something better lay ahead. Every bump, every cracked axle, every muddy crossing was one line written in the story of American expansion, carved not in ink, but in wheel ruts and willpower. Life on the trail was not the romantic adventure story some might imagine. It was long, grueling, and soaked in dust. Each day began before sunrise. Roosters weren't needed. The creak of leather harnesses and the groan of wagon wheels were alarm clocks enough. The average wagon train moved about 10 to 15 miles per day, depending on weather, terrain, and how many axles broke that morning. Over time, trails like the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California routes carved themselves into the earth, each lined with discarded belongings, broken wheels, and the graves of those who never made it west. Meals were simple, hardy, and endlessly repetitive. Coffee was a luxury, water a gamble. Streams could be clean or crawling with bacteria. Boiling it helped, if you had the fuel and time. Otherwise it was luck and prayer. Food was rationed, salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and sometimes wild game, if someone could shoot straight. Wild onions and berries became treasured delicacies. Illness was the greatest killer on the trail. Cholera swept through camps like wildfire. It came from contaminated water and killed quickly, within hours sometimes. Dysentery, scurvy, and snake bites took others. There were no doctors, only home remedies and hope. Sometimes hope wasn't enough. Still, there were moments of joy. Children played with sticks and stones, or skipped along the wagon's shadow. Weddings occasionally took place on the trail. So did births. Entire families were forged not just by blood, but by shared hardship and dust-soaked camaraderie. At night, the wagons circled, not to fend off native attacks, as often mythologized, but for protection against thieves, animals, and the cold wind. Fires were lit, bread was baked on hot stones, and someone might pull out a fiddle. For a few hours, laughter and music pushed back the darkness, but rest was always brief. Tomorrow brought more walking, more wilderness, and fewer guarantees. Life on the trail was survival by routine. You learned to love your boots and hate your blisters. You learned to mourn quietly and move forward anyway. Because the land didn't wait for grief, it only moved west. After weeks or even months on the trail, the sight of trees, water, and flat land was enough to make a pioneer fall to their knees in gratitude. But celebration was short-lived, because once a family found their spot, the real work began. Homesteading wasn't glamorous. There were no pre-built homes waiting, no fences, no roads, just open land and the ticking clock of the seasons. The first priority? Shelter. Usually a one-room log cabin, barely large enough to hold the family that built it. Tools were limited, and every log had to be felled, trimmed, and hauled by hand or oxen. No chainsaws, no blueprints, just axes, grit, and guesswork. Most cabins had dirt floors, which turned to mud in the rain and froze solid in winter. Windows were often just holes covered with animal hide or greased paper to let in light while keeping out the worst of the cold. A chimney was luxury. Many cabins started with simple holes in the roof to vent smoke. you coughed a lot. Inside, the family slept on piles of straw, furs, or corn husks. Beds were made from rope strung across wooden frames. If you were lucky, the gaps between logs were sealed with mud and moss to keep out the wind. If you weren't, the wind came in anyway. And then came the first winter, the season that tested every soul. If the family hadn't stored enough firewood or food, the months ahead could mean starvation or frostbite. Snowstorms might trap them inside for days. Coyotes howled in the dark. Wolves circled. But still the frontier spirit endured. Families made candles from animal fat. Children learned to patch clothes and cook over open fires. They read from the Bible by firelight. They wrote letters home, if there was a place to send them. Neighbours were few and far between. But when a new cabin appeared on the horizon, help was offered. A shared roof raising, a borrowed cow, a hot meal. Survival wasn't about toughness. It was about community. One family couldn't last, but 10 might. The first winter on the frontier wasn't just cold. It was a quiet crucible, where dreams were either hardened into resolve or buried beneath the snow. On the American frontier, strength wasn't measured in muscle alone. It was measured in endurance, sacrifice, and quiet, relentless courage. And no one embodied that more than frontier women. Forget the dainty damsels of dime novels. These women were warriors in aprons. The moment they stepped off the wagon, they became builders, farmers, midwives, butchers, doctors, and teachers, all wrapped into one. If something needed doing, they did it, because there was no one else. They woke before dawn to churn butter, bake bread, and milk cows, all before most men even rubbed their eyes. They planted gardens, preserved food, tended to livestock, and sewed everything the family wore, often from scratch. In times of sickness, they administered herbal remedies. In childbirth, they acted as midwives, sometimes for neighbours, sometimes for themselves, alone. A woman on the frontier could kill a snake with a shovel in the morning and teach her children to read by afternoon. She might lose a child to fever and still have dinner on the table by sundown. Guns were no stranger to their hands. If their husbands were away, or gone for good, women defended the homestead with whatever was available: rifles, axes, frying pans. There are stories of women fending off wolves, outlaws, and even raiders, all while holding a baby on one hip. Loneliness was the enemy too. For some, the nearest neighbour might be miles away. Letters took weeks, even months, to arrive. The silence could be deafening. And yet, these women endured, knitting civilization from wilderness, one stitch, one lesson, one loaf at a time. Frontier women also formed the heart of community. They organized barn raisings, cared for sick neighbors, and hosted Sunday gatherings when churches were still only blueprints. When towns finally sprang up, it was often the women who insisted on schools, libraries, and law. They weren't background characters in the story of the frontier. They were the backbone. Uncelebrated, overworked, and often overlooked, yet impossible to forget once you knew their strength. So, the next time you picture the Wild West, don't just think of cowboys on horses. Think of a woman, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled up, shotgun by the door, and cornbread in the oven. For every wagon that rolled westward, for every cabin raised and field ploughed, there was already someone there. The American frontier wasn't empty. It was occupied by hundreds of indigenous nations who had called the land home for centuries, even millennia. From the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, the land was deeply woven with native life: hunting grounds, sacred sites, migration paths, rivers filled with meaning. But to the US government, and to most pioneers, this wasn't seen as home. It was seen as potential, and so began a long, painful unravelling of promises. The US government signed treaty after treaty with native tribes, agreements that promised peace, land rights, and resources. But almost every one of these treaties was broken. As settlers poured westward, tribes were pushed back, then pushed again. Sometimes it was with ink, sometimes with fire and bullets, Entire nations were forced onto reservations, often barren and far from ancestral homes. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Lakota, Comanche, and dozens more were made strangers on their own land. Some native groups tried diplomacy, others resisted. Armed conflicts erupted. The Black Hawk War, the Sand Creek Massacre, Little Bighorn. But even when native warriors won a battle, they lost the war. The government simply kept coming, with troops, with railroads, with settlers hungry for space and willing to claim it at any cost. It wasn't just a land grab. It was cultural erasure. Children were taken from families, sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages. Sacred traditions were outlawed. Native identity was treated as something to be erased, civilized, or rewritten. And yet, through it all, indigenous peoples survived. Their languages were whispered in secret. Their songs were sung in defiance. Their stories passed down like living fire. The romantic image of the frontier often forgets this cost. But the truth remains. Westward expansion was not a triumph for all. For many, it was a slow, devastating march of loss. To understand the American frontier is to hold both truths at once, the resilience of pioneers and the tragedy of the people they displaced, because history, like the land itself, holds more than one story. On the American frontier, law and order arrived late, and sometimes not at all. In many newly settled towns, there were no police, no courthouses, and no jails. Justice was less about due process and more about who had the loudest voice, the fastest draw, or the biggest gang behind them. In short, the law on the frontier wore many faces, and not all of them were good guys. At first, it was the vigilantes who stepped in. Citizens' committees would form when a crime was committed. A horse stolen, a shop robbed, or worse. They held makeshift trials in saloons or under trees. And if guilt was assumed, punishment came fast. A bullet, a rope, or being run out of town with a warning and a bruised ego. Eventually, the towns grew, and with them came lawmen, sheriffs, marshals, and deputies. Names like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became legend. Some were brave, some were crooked. Most were a little of both. With a tin badge and a revolver, they were the thin line between chaos and order. But just as quickly as lawmen arrived, so did the outlaws. The frontier was a magnet for drifters, deserters, gamblers, and gunslingers looking to vanish into the dust. Men like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy didn't just rob banks and trains. They captured imaginations. Newspapers turned them into folk heroes, even as they left trails of bodies and broken safes behind. Frontier justice was unpredictable. A man could be hanged for stealing a horse, or walk free after a murder if the jury liked his story better. Bribes worked. So did threats. And sometimes, justice was just revenge in a fancier hat. Even the courtroom, when it existed, was often little more than a general store with a judge who also ran the hardware counter. Despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, frontier communities slowly built systems of law. Judges replaced vigilantes. Prisons replaced tree limbs. But the myths never died, and maybe they never will. Because on the edge of the known world, justice wasn't blind. It was armed, dusty, and didn't ask twice. At first, the American frontier moved at the speed of a wagon wheel, slow, creaky, and weather permitting. But by the mid to late 1800s, the silence of the prairie was shattered by a new sound. The steam whistle. The arrival of the railroad changed everything. Suddenly, journeys that once took months by wagon could be completed in days. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected east to west in a steel embrace that transformed the frontier from wilderness into a corridor of commerce. Settlers flooded in. Towns popped up overnight beside new depots. And goods, everything from stoves to sewing needles, arrived by train, no longer hoarded or handmade. For pioneers, the railroad meant survival. It meant medicine could arrive before a fever turned deadly. It meant crops could be sold beyond the local market. It meant letters, long delayed by weather and rivers, could now travel in days. The frontier became less of a gamble and more of a calculated risk. But the railroad didn't come alone. Alongside it ran the telegraph wire, thin, humming strands of copper that stitched the country together with dots and dashes. The telegraph gave the frontier something it had never had before: instant communication. A rancher in Wyoming could get news of a presidential election within minutes. A sheriff could call for help from 100 miles away. Isolation, the great fear of the early pioneer, was dying, one beep at a time. The impact was huge. Economies expanded. Government reached farther. Law enforcement got faster. But not everyone welcomed it. Indigenous tribes saw railroads and telegraph poles as intrusions, signals that the land they once roamed freely was now bound by wires and owned in sections. Some fought back, sabotaging lines, derailing trains, delaying the inevitable. Yet progress rolled on. The iron horse was unstoppable. Towns that the railroad skipped were left to wither. Others boomed, becoming cities almost overnight. The wilderness was shrinking, mile by mile, rail by rail. And while the frontier spirit didn't disappear, it was no longer isolated. It was plugged in, connected, and commercialized. The frontier was still wild, but now it ran on steam and signals. By the end of the 19th century, something profound had changed. The line that once separated wilderness from settlement, the famed frontier line, had blurred, faded, and finally disappeared. In 1890, the US Census Bureau officially declared, "There can hardly be said to be a frontier line." In other words, the American frontier was closed. The great push westward was over. The forests had been cleared. The railroads linked coast to coast. The buffalo were nearly gone. Tribes were confined to reservations. The land, once vast and mysterious, had been measured, mapped, and sold by the acre. But what did that mean? For some, it meant victory. The dream had been realized, a continent tamed, a nation stretched from sea to sea. For others, especially native peoples and displaced communities, it meant erasure, loss, and a bitter silence where homelands had once been. Yet the end of the frontier wasn't just about geography, it was about identity. The rugged individualism, the myth of the lone pioneer, the campfire stories of heroism and hardship, these didn't vanish. They became legend. Writers like Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had shaped the very soul of America, its democracy, its grit, its restlessness. The frontier taught Americans to adapt, to survive, to rely on themselves and their neighbors. It gave birth to the cowboy, the log cabin president, the gold rush prospector, all icons woven into the fabric of national myth. But the reality was messier. The frontier was sweat, dirt, disease, and death. It was brave and brutal, hopeful and unjust. It was full of contradictions, and its legacy remains a reflection of that tension. Today the frontier lives on, not in geography, but in spirit, in the idea that pushing into the unknown, whether it's land, science, or space, defines what it means to be American. The wagons no longer roll, the cabins are museums, the trails are highways. But if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes in the prairie wind, carried on stories passed down from those who dared to go farther. The American frontier didn't vanish. It became the foundation. Nimrum. Before there were instruments, there was rhythm, the beat of a foot on earth, the clap of two hands, the thump of a heart in a quiet chest. Music did not begin with wood or string or bone. It began with the body. It began with breath. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing, agriculture, or architecture, early humans found something extraordinary in sound. In caves and on plains, around fires and in forests, they discovered that certain movements, a stomp, A shout, a whistle, could stir emotion, call attention, or even comfort fear. Music, it seems, is not a cultural invention. It is a biological instinct. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled in the flickering light of a fire. One begins to hum, a low rising tone. Another claps in rhythm. A third starts to mimic bird calls. There are no words, just sound. And in that moment, they are no longer just individuals surviving the elements. They are connected. They are human. Before the flute, before the drum, sound itself was sacred. Many anthropologists believe that early music may have emerged from imitation, copying animal calls for hunting or mimicking natural sounds to communicate across distances. But at some point, these sounds crossed the line from utility to expression. A rhythm became more than a signal. It became a language of emotion. A hum became a lullaby. A scream became a song. There's a theory that music came before language, or at least alongside it, that before we spoke, we sang. Infants even today respond more instinctively to tone and melody than to speech. Something about pitch, rhythm, and vibration is hardwired into us. We didn't just invent music, we remembered it. And perhaps most beautifully, these first sounds weren't reserved for the elite or the gifted. They were universal, a shared experience of early humans across continents. Music was made in Africa, Asia, Europe. Anywhere there were voices and hands and something to strike or shake. Before the first flute was carved from bone, before strings were stretched and drums were skinned, humans already knew. Sound could move the soul. And that was just the beginning. In the chill of Ice Age Europe, where mammoths roamed and glaciers carved the land, a quiet revolution took place, not in tools or fire, but in sound. Somewhere in a cave, an early human picked up a hollow bird bone, bored a few holes into it, and blew. Out came a tone. Pure, haunting, intentional. This was no accident. This was the birth of the musical instrument. Archaeologists have uncovered bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years, making them some of the oldest known instruments on Earth. Found in sites like the Hohlfels cave in Germany, these flutes were made from vulture wing bones or mammoth ivory. Not easy materials to work with. But their makers took the time to carve finger holes at precise intervals, allowing for a range of notes. That precision tells us something profound. This wasn't random. It was music. Structured, repeatable, crafted for expression. Why did they do it? Perhaps the sound mimicked birdsong, a call to nature. Perhaps it accompanied rituals, marking the transition from life to death or the passage of seasons. Or maybe, just maybe, someone made a flute because they wanted to make beauty in the darkness. It's easy to think of prehistoric humans as crude, focused solely on survival. But the flute suggests otherwise. It speaks of creativity, of a mind that looked at a bone and didn't see food, but possibility. These instruments also imply community. A flute played alone makes music, yes. But in a group, it creates rhythm, harmony, and shared experience. Around a fire, flutes may have joined voices, clapping or drumming on logs and stones. The music would rise, echoing off cave walls, the first concerts in human history. And consider this. These Ice Age flutes predate the invention of agriculture, the wheel, and even writing. In the hierarchy of innovation, music came early, not as a luxury, but as a need. The flutes of the Ice Age weren't just tools. They were expressions of joy, sorrow, mystery, and ritual. Fragile whispers from the deep past, still capable of moving us today. From bone and breath, humanity made melody. If the flute was our first voice, then the drum was our heartbeat. Long before cities, long before kings, there were circles of people gathered under stars, clapping, stomping, and pounding rhythm into the ground. The drum wasn't invented in one place. It emerged everywhere, across continents and cultures, as if the human body and Earth itself were asking to be synchronized. The earliest drums were likely simple. stretched animal skin over a hollow log or clay pot. They were tools of rhythm, yes, but also of ritual, communication, and power. A drum beat could summon a god, lead an army, or call a village together. It wasn't just noise, it was a signal. In Africa, some of the oldest known drum traditions trace back tens of thousands of years. There, drums became voices, instruments that could speak tonal languages, mimicking human phrases. In Siberia, shamans used drums to enter trances, their rhythms unlocking gateways to the spirit world. In the Amazon, the sound of a water drum echoed through the jungle like thunder made by human hands. What made the drums so essential wasn't just its sound, but its universality. You didn't need melody. You didn't need formal training. You just needed to feel the beat. And feel it we did. Drums were used in birth ceremonies, funerals, weddings, harvests, and wars. Their pulse gave structure to chaos. A rhythm could bind a tribe together, unify a ritual, or prepare warriors for battle. The beat said, "We are one." Even in early agriculture, drumming had a place. Farmers beat sticks to scare away birds. Harvest festivals featured dances led by drum beats. Rhythm marked time, not just hours, but seasons, cycles, and transitions. Over time, drums evolved. People added carvings, paint, and spiritual symbols to their instruments. Drums were not just functional, they were sacred objects, representing fertility, protection, or divine connection. And always, they connected us. Across language barriers, across generations, across worlds. In a world before clocks, electricity, or writing, rhythm was how we counted, and how we felt. Drums brought sound to life. They made time tangible. And in their pounding, we found not just music, we found meaning. As humanity moved from caves to cities, music evolved from survival ritual into sophisticated art. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where rivers carved kingdoms and writing was born. Here, music began to look elegant. Among the temples and ziggurats, we find some of the earliest depictions of stringed instruments, harps and lyres, drawn on tablets, carved into walls, and even buried with kings. These weren't bone flutes made in secret. They were crafted with care, adorned with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, their curves as graceful as their sound. The harp, in particular, became a symbol of refinement, religion, and royalty. Just an instrument, but a myth in wood and string. These early harps didn't have frets or fingerboards. Strings were plucked by hand, and each tone was fixed. But what they lacked in flexibility, they made up for in atmosphere. A Mesopotamian harp didn't shout like a drum. It whispered. Its notes hung in the air like incense, sacred, dreamlike. In these cities, music became organized. Musicians were trained. Scales and intervals were recorded in cuneiform. The harp was used in ceremonies, storytelling, and even astronomy, as scholars mapped the stars and matched them to harmonies, believing the heavens themselves sang in celestial intervals. The presence of harps in Mesopotamian burial sites tells us something profound. Music was believed to follow the soul beyond death. It wasn't just entertainment. It was spiritual architecture, building bridges between worlds. And unlike the thunder of drums or the primal howl of flutes, harps brought a new quality to music. Intimacy. Soft, thoughtful, deliberate. For the first time, perhaps, sound was not just for the gods or the tribe. It was for reflection. With a stretched string and a wooden frame, Mesopotamians gave voice to silence. And from that silence, the first melodies of civilization were born. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't just an art, it was a divine language. The Egyptians believed that music was a gift from the gods. According to myth, it was the goddess Bat, later merged with Hathor, the goddess of joy, fertility, and music, who first brought song into the world. And so, music became more than melody. It was ritual, identity, and spiritual architecture, resonating through temples, tombs, and marketplaces alike. Unlike the primal flutes of prehistory or the ceremonial harps of Mesopotamia, Egyptian music blended ritual precision with everyday life. Workers sang to keep rhythm as they built pyramids. Fishermen sang to the Nile. Priests performed hymns during sacred rites. Women played frame drums and rattles during childbirth and funerals, moments of beginning and end. The most iconic Egyptian instruments were harps, lutes, lyres, sistrums, and flutes. Harps evolved from simple angular shapes to large, curved, decorative pieces with long, arched necks, symbols of status as much as sound. Some had up to 22 strings, crafted with such elegance that they appear in tomb paintings, still vivid 3,000 years later. The sistrum, however, held a unique place. A type of rattle with metal rods that jingled when shaken, it was closely associated with goddess worship, especially that of Hathor and Isis. The sound wasn't meant for amusement. It was meant to awaken the divine, to shake off evil, and to protect the soul during ceremonies. Musicians in Egypt weren't always commoners. Some were priests or priestesses, serving in temples through music. Others were court musicians, entertaining pharaohs and foreign dignitaries with songs praising gods, kings, and legacy. Music also bridged worlds. In funerals, songs and chants guided the soul through the underworld. Tombs of the wealthy often included lyrics, and even illustrations, of instruments and musicians, as if to ensure the departed would be accompanied by sound in the afterlife. For ancient Egyptians, music was eternal. It honored the gods, unified the people, and reminded them of cosmic order. Ma'at. Rhythm wasn't chaos. It was the heartbeat of the universe. In Egypt, to make music was to echo the sacred. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't just an art form. It was a science of the soul and of the universe itself. While other civilizations used music in ritual and celebration, the Greeks asked a deeper question: why does sound move us? And their answer was found not just in poetry or philosophy, but in mathematics. Enter Pythagoras, the philosopher best known today for his triangle, but who also played a monumental role in the origins of music theory. According to legend, Pythagoras passed a blacksmith's shop and noticed something strange. The sound of hammer strikes changed depending on the size and weight of the hammers. This inspired an experiment with strings. He discovered that when a string was divided in simple ratios, like 1.2 or 2.3, it produced consonant, harmonious tones. This revelation birthed the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that the cosmos itself operated on mathematical ratios, and that music was an echo of universal order. Every plucked string wasn't just a note. It was a mirror of the heavens. Greek instruments reflected this philosophy. The lyre, a small harp-like instrument, became a symbol of civilization and education. Poets like Homer and Sappho were often depicted with one in hand. The aulos, a double-reeded pipe, provided the wild, emotive contrast, played in dramas, rituals, and sometimes in war. Music in Greece was deeply tied to ethics and character. The philosopher Plato believed different musical modes could influence the soul, some inspiring courage, others promoting laziness or chaos. He advocated for strict musical education to shape ideal citizens. In his view, the wrong scale could be as dangerous as poor governance. But for the Greeks, music wasn't about entertainment alone. It was medicine. It was morality. It was mathematical perfection vibrating through flesh and air. They laid the foundations for music theory, notation systems, and acoustics. Their understanding of intervals, scales, and harmony would echo for centuries through Roman, medieval, and modern thought. In Greece, music became more than sound. It became a bridge between reason and emotion, between numbers and beauty, a place where the soul could both calculate and soar. If Greece gave music its philosophy, Rome gave it volume. In the Roman world, music was about function, form, and force. It accompanied festivals, religious ceremonies, gladiator games, and most famously, the battlefield. Where the Greeks saw music as a bridge to the divine, the Romans saw it as a tool of order and empire. One of the most iconic instruments of Roman power was the cornu, a massive, curved brass horn shaped like a G and often taller than the soldier who carried it. The cornu wasn't for melody, it was for command. Its blast signalled troop movements, battle charges, and retreat orders across noisy battlefields. Roman generals didn't just shout, they orchestrated war. Alongside the cornu was the tuba, no relation to the modern one, a straight trumpet that could cut through the chaos of combat. Together, these instruments helped keep the Roman army, the most disciplined force in the world, moving in sync. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers marching in time to the brassy, haunting calls of these ancient horns. It wasn't just organization. It was psychological warfare. But Roman music wasn't all military. In temples, tibiae, double flutes, accompanied sacred rites. In arenas, music opened gladiator games, not unlike a modern national anthem before a sporting event. At banquets, lyres and hydraulis, an early water-powered pipe organ, created ambience for elite guests. Music flowed through Roman daily life like wine, structured, performative, essential. They borrowed heavily from the Greeks, but reworked everything to fit their own ethos. Where Greece emphasized individual expression and introspection, Rome emphasized public spectacle and control. Music was entertainment and propaganda, and when Rome absorbed Egypt, Judea, Gaul, and beyond, it absorbed their sounds too. Roman music became a mosaic, blending African rhythms, Eastern melodies, and Mediterranean instruments into something vast and ever-evolving. Yet unlike Greek philosophers, Roman thinkers wrote little about the theory of music. They played it, used it, marched to it, but rarely analysed it. For Rome, sound was a means, not a mystery. In the end, Rome didn't refine music. It amplified it, until even the farthest provinces heard the beat of the empire's drums. While the West marched to the rhythms of empire, the East was exploring something else, the soul of sound. In ancient India, music was not merely an art form, it was a path to the divine. Rooted in the Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in existence, Indian music began as chant. The Samaveda, in particular, was a collection of hymns designed not just to be read, but sung. These chants followed intricate melodic patterns called saman, meant to elevate consciousness and harmonize the universe. As Indian civilization evolved, so did its instruments. The veena, an early stringed instrument, became associated with Saraswati, goddess of knowledge and the arts. The mridangam, a barrel-shaped drum, kept time during sacred performances. Every note, every rhythm was tied to ragas and talas, melodic and rhythmic frameworks that were believed to evoke specific emotions, times of day, even spiritual states. Music wasn't for entertainment. It was discipline, meditation, a way to balance inner energies and touch the eternal. Meanwhile, in ancient China, music was equally sacred, but also political. The legendary Emperor Shun, one of China's mythical 5 emperors, was said to have harmonized the empire through music. Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, held that proper music led to moral behavior and social order. The right notes created harmony not just in the soul, but in the state. Instruments were carefully designed to reflect cosmic balance. The guqin, a 7-stringed zither, was played in solitude by scholars and sages. Its soft, meditative tones, meant to reflect introspection and virtue. The sheng, a mouth-blown reed instrument, symbolized unity through its many pipes working as one. The bianzhong, a set of bronze bells, was used in royal courts to represent hierarchy and ritual structure. Chinese music was tuned to precise mathematical intervals that matched natural cycles, aligning humanity with the heavens. In both India and China, music was not separate from life. It was life, a mirror of the cosmos, a code of discipline. a sacred pulse. While Rome used music to conquer, the East used it to commune, with the divine, with nature, with the self. From the thrum of bone flutes in Ice Age caves to the shimmering strings of Mesopotamia, from Egyptian sistrums that summoned gods to Chinese zithers that calmed emperors, music has always been more than entertainment. It is a language without borders, a force that predates empires and outlasts them. But why has music endured when so many other inventions have faded? Because music speaks directly to something we can't explain,